There's a mountain in Iran that has become one of the most closely watched pieces of geography on the planet, and the reason has almost nothing to do with its scenery. It's called Pickaxe Mountain, known locally as Ku-i-Kolangazla, and it sits in the Zagros Range about 140 miles south of Tehran, less than 2 miles from the Natanz nuclear complex that American and Israeli forces have already struck twice, once in a short war in the middle of last year, and again after the broader conflict reignited this past February. Iran has been quietly excavating tunnels into that mountain since 2020, and over the past week it has gone from being a name buried in intelligence assessments to something President Trump is now saying out loud on the record on a nationally syndicated radio show. That shift from classified concern to public threat tells you a lot about where this war is heading. So it's worth slowing down and actually walking through what's known, what's still genuinely uncertain, and why the answer matters well beyond Iran's borders. Start with what Trump actually said, because the exact wording matters more than the summary. In an interview on the Hugh Hewitt show earlier this week, the president said, "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain. Tell the Iranians to be ready." In the same conversation, though, he also said something that complicates the picture. We're watching Pickaxe Mountain very closely. We don't see any activity there. He described it as a possible target for a nice big fat shot right near the front door, and said the U.S. would probably give Pickaxe a hit relatively soon. Put those statements side by side and you get a genuinely mixed signal. This is a president publicly naming a specific nuclear-linked target and promising to strike it, while simultaneously acknowledging that American intelligence isn't currently seeing activity that would normally justify an urgent strike. That's not necessarily a contradiction. It could reflect a strategy of pressure and deterrence rather than an imminent operational order, a way of telling Tehran the site is being watched, and that any attempt to use it will be met immediately, without that being the same thing as a strike being locked in for a specific night. It's also possible it reflects genuine internal debate inside the administration about whether and when to act. Either way, the responsible read of the public record right now is that Pickaxe Mountain is a serious, live possibility, not a confirmed, scheduled operation. And it's worth being precise about that distinction, rather than presenting a threat as if it were already a fact on the ground. So what is this place, actually? Pickaxe Mountain is a fortified underground facility with construction that has continued for roughly 6 years, including reportedly through periods when Iran was nominally bound by ceasefire terms and a memorandum of understanding with the United States. Reporting on its depth varies depending on the source, with independent nuclear monitoring analysts estimating the underground complex sites somewhere between roughly 300 and 450 feet beneath solid granite, though some accounts describe even greater depths. Whatever the precise figure, the consistent theme across expert assessments is that it was purpose-built to survive exactly the kind of weapon the United States used against Iran's other nuclear sites last year. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound precision-guided bunker buster that is the most powerful non-nuclear weapon in the American arsenal, and the only aircraft certified to carry it, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, flew the mission that dropped more than a dozen of them on Iran's Fordow and Natanz facilities in a single long-range strike operation last year. Iran watched that operation unfold, studied the damage afterward, and, according to satellite imagery reviewed by independent monitoring groups, has spent the time since deliberately hardening Pickaxe Mountain against a repeat performance. The International Atomic Energy Agency's Director General has said publicly that Iran never hid its intention to move sensitive nuclear-related work underground, calling it part of a broader, openly stated strategy, rather than a secret program uncovered by outside intelligence. That's an important nuance, because it cuts against a narrative of Iran being caught red-handed doing something entirely covert. At the same time, independent nuclear watchdog organizations that track satellite imagery of Iranian nuclear sites have reported specific, concrete signs of ongoing construction and reinforcement at the site well into this year, including tunnel entrances that remain open, vehicle activity consistent with continued excavation, and, in imagery reviewed earlier in the year, efforts to camouflage or backfill one of the eastern tunnel entrances, seemingly to protect it from being targeted. Iran's official public position has consistently been that the facility is intended for assembling and manufacturing advanced centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium, rather than being a site where weapons-grade material itself would be produced or stored. And Iranian officials have denied any intention to build a nuclear weapon at all, consistent with the position Tehran has held throughout the broader nuclear standoff with the West for years. Whether that official framing fully describes everything happening underground is exactly the question outside intelligence agencies and nuclear monitors have been trying to answer. And it's one where honest, credentialed analysts disagree on the details, even when they agree the site is concerning. There's also real expert disagreement about whether a strike would even work, which is a detail that tends to get lost in more breathless coverage. Assessments of the facility's depth put core areas potentially beyond the confirmed penetration capability of the same bunker buster bombs that worked against Fordow, meaning a strike using existing weapons might damage entrances, ventilation shafts, and surface infrastructure without necessarily destroying whatever is deepest inside the mountain. That's part of why some nuclear security specialists have argued that if Iran has been careful about sealing or concealing its ventilation and support infrastructure, a purely aerial bunker buster campaign might not settle the question the way a strike on Fordow's more exposed structure did last year, and why some outside analysts have floated that ground operations, not just aircraft, could ultimately be a more effective way to physically deny use of a site this deep. None of that is a reason to dismiss the concern. It's a reason to be honest that the military problem here is harder than the Fordow precedent might suggest, and that a strike, if it happens, may not be a clean, one-time solution the way it was sometimes described after last year's operation. That brings up the other side of this story worth sitting with, which is how last year's strikes were actually described at the time versus how the underlying reality now looks. After the United States hit Iran's major nuclear facilities in the middle of last year, both the President and the White House used the word obliteration, describing the damage to Iran's nuclear program as monumental and total, and dismissing reporting that suggested otherwise as inaccurate. A year later, the US and Iran are roughly 5 months into a renewed, sustained war. Iran has demonstrated real leverage by threatening and periodically disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Global energy prices have moved in response, and the administration is now talking publicly about hitting another nuclear-linked facility that wasn't touched in that earlier round. That trajectory, obliteration declared, then a return to hitting nuclear infrastructure roughly a year later, is worth including in any honest account of where things stand. Not because it proves the original strikes failed, since a lot can be true at once, including that a great deal of real damage was done to Iran's declared enrichment sites, while other capacity or material still survived elsewhere, but because it's a useful corrective against treating any single strike, including a hypothetical one on Pickaxe Mountain, as guaranteed to permanently end the underlying concern. Material accounting is the other piece of this that deserves careful, honest treatment, because the numbers involved are genuinely significant and also genuinely disputed depending on the source. Before last year's strikes, independent estimates suggested Iran had accumulated a stockpile of uranium enriched to around 60%, an amount that outside nuclear security analysts have said would be sufficient, if further enriched to weapons grade, to produce material for multiple nuclear devices spread across facilities including Fordow, Natanz, and tunnel complexes near Esfahan. American and Israeli strikes are understood to have destroyed, damaged, or rendered inaccessible a substantial amount of that material, and the centrifuges needed to further enrich it. But serious, still unresolved questions remain about exactly how much of that stockpile was actually destroyed versus simply buried or moved, and it's that uncertainty, more than any single satellite image of Pickaxe Mountain itself, that appears to be driving the renewed American focus on the site. If any meaningful quantity of that material survived and could be moved to a facility engineered specifically to be harder to strike than Fordow was, that would represent precisely the kind of scenario the Massive Ordnance Penetrator strikes last year were supposed to foreclose, which is presumably why the administration is treating this as urgent, even while acknowledging it isn't currently observing overt activity at the site. It's worth being clear-eyed about the broader war this sits inside of, because Pickaxe Mountain isn't happening in isolation. Over the past several weeks, U.S. Central Command has run a sustained, near-nightly campaign of strikes against Iranian military targets, framed primarily around degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, after Iranian forces attacked several vessels transiting the waterway. CENTCOM's own public statements describe strikes on Iranian command centers, air defense and coastal surveillance sites, missile and drone storage and launch facilities, and naval capabilities across locations spread along a large stretch of Iran's coastline. That campaign has run for well over a week straight at the time of this recording, with the American military describing consecutive nights of strikes and characterizing its posture as vigilant and ready for further operations. The nuclear question and the shipping lane question are related, but distinct fronts in the same war, and the renewed focus on Pickaxe Mountain suggests the administration may be preparing to widen the target set from purely conventional military and naval infrastructure back toward the nuclear program specifically, something that would represent a significant escalation beyond the pattern of the past several weeks. Iran's side of this needs real space too, and it's worth resisting the temptation to reduce Tehran's position to a single caricature. Iranian officials, including a senior advisor to the country's leadership, have publicly described Pickaxe Mountain as one of the most fortified nuclear-related facilities in the world, and have warned in fairly dramatic terms that a strike on it would provoke a severe region-wide response. Iran's government maintains that its nuclear activities, including whatever is happening at Pickaxe Mountain, are not aimed at building a weapon. a position it has held consistently, even as international inspectors and Western governments have expressed skepticism at various points over the years. From Tehran's perspective, and from the perspective of those who find its position credible, a strike on a facility Iran describes as being for centrifuge assembly, rather than weapons-grade enrichment or storage, would represent an act of war against infrastructure that hasn't been definitively proven to cross the line the United States says justifies attacking it, layered on top of a war that Iran already frames as having begun with the killing of its head of state back in February. There are also Iranian voices, including some domestic critics of the government, who argue that continuing to invest in hardened nuclear infrastructure while the country is already absorbing weeks of sustained conventional strikes and economic pressure is a strategically questionable choice that invites exactly the kind of attack now being threatened, rather than a defensible act of national self-protection. Both of those perspectives exist inside Iran's own fractured political conversation, and an honest account of this story should leave room for that disagreement rather than assuming Iranian society speaks with one voice on the matter. There's also a practical, logistical layer to this that outside analysts have been watching closely, because it often tells you more than public statements do. Sustaining a B-2 strike package against a target as far from American basing as central Iran requires extensive aerial refueling support, since the bomber has to fly extremely long missions, often with multiple refuelings over open ocean, to reach the target and return. Reports in the past week describe the administration moving a significant number of additional refueling tankers into position in Israel, which independent defense analysts have flagged as one of the more concrete, verifiable signals of preparation for a sustained heavy bomber operation, as distinct from the kind of statement that can be made on a radio show without any accompanying military movement. That doesn't confirm a strike is imminent, since tanker repositioning could also serve broader regional operations, deterrent signaling, or contingency planning that never gets executed. But it's a more tangible data point than rhetoric alone, and it's part of why outside observers are treating the Pickaxe Mountain threat as more than just political messaging, even while acknowledging that Trump himself has said American intelligence currently isn't observing the kind of activity at the site that would typically be the trigger for an urgent strike. Zoom out for a moment and look at what else is happening globally at the same time, because none of this is unfolding in a vacuum, and the broader pattern is worth understanding on its own terms. Russia carried out one of the largest ballistic missile attacks of its entire war against Ukraine's capital this past weekend, launching more than 40 missiles, a mix of ballistic weapons including hypersonic systems and cruise missiles, alongside well over 100 attack drones, in a single overnight assault on Kyiv. At least one person was killed and more than a dozen others were wounded, with residential buildings, a supermarket, and other civilian infrastructure damaged across several districts of the city, and Ukrainian officials described it as among the most intense ballistic barrages aimed at the capital since the invasion began more than 4 years ago. Ukraine's air defenses intercepted or suppressed a significant share of the incoming drones and roughly half of the ballistic missiles, but a meaningful number still got through, a reminder that Ukraine's own air defense interceptor stockpiles, particularly for the Patriot systems that are the primary defense against ballistic missiles, have been under real strain. That attack came against the backdrop of Ukraine continuing its own long-range strike campaign against Russian energy and logistics infrastructure, including strikes on facilities Kyiv says supply components for Russian drone and navigation systems, and continued Ukrainian attacks on tankers supporting Russian military logistics. Separately, tensions in the Asia-Pacific region have continued to simmer, with China conducting submarine-launched ballistic missile testing activity in the South China Sea in recent weeks, activity that regional security analysts generally read as a signal aimed primarily at Taiwan and at demonstrating Chinese strategic capability amid the broader competition for influence in the region, though it's worth being cautious about overinterpreting any single test as a sign of imminent action. Taken together, what you have right now is 3 of the world's most significant security flashpoints all running hot at essentially the same time. A U.S.-Iran war that may be about to widen from conventional strikes back to a nuclear facility target, a Russia-Ukraine war producing some of its most intense missile barrages of the entire conflict, and rising military signaling in the Pacific around Taiwan. None of these are directly connected in a causal sense, but they do compound each other in terms of how much global attention, military resourcing, and diplomatic bandwidth is available to manage any one of them carefully. And it's worth naming that reality rather than treating each story in total isolation from the others, since decision makers in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran are all watching each other's conflicts as they calculate their own next moves. Coming back to Iran specifically, there's a broader strategic picture forming around how the United States appears to be thinking about the endgame here, separate from the immediate question of any single strike, and it's a picture that has been building for weeks rather than emerging suddenly this week. Alongside the military pressure campaign, the Trump administration has also been pursuing a parallel economic and diplomatic track aimed at reducing the world's dependence on the Strait of Hormuz altogether. Reporting this week describes a large-scale pipeline initiative discussed during a White House meeting between President Trump and Iraq's prime minister. An infrastructure project reportedly worth hundreds of billions of dollars aimed at moving Middle Eastern oil through overland and Mediterranean routes that would bypass the strait entirely, framed publicly as part of a broader shift toward economic integration with Iraq as American forces complete a withdrawal from the country. Whether or not that specific project ultimately gets built at that scale, the underlying strategic logic is worth understanding on its own terms. If the United States and its regional partners can meaningfully reduce how much of the world's oil supply has to pass through a choke point Iran can threaten, that changes the leverage calculus in any future negotiation, potentially reducing Iran's single most powerful point of pressure over global energy markets, regardless of how the current military confrontation over the strait itself gets resolved. It's also worth explaining a bit more about the weapon at the center of this story, because the Massive Ordnance Penetrator has taken on an almost mythical status in coverage of this conflict, and it deserves a more grounded explanation. The bomb is roughly 30,000 pounds, guided by GPS and inertial navigation, and designed to punch through many feet of reinforced concrete or hardened rock before detonating deep underground, where the blast does the most damage to a facility's internal structure, rather than just cratering the surface above it. It was developed specifically with deeply buried, hardened targets in mind, the kind of facility that conventional smaller bombs simply can't reach. The B-2 Spirit is the only aircraft cleared to carry it operationally, a low observable long-range bomber that can fly from bases in the continental United States to targets on the other side of the world with multiple aerial refuelings along the way. Last year's operation against Fordow and Natanz was, by any account, one of the most complex bomber missions flown in decades. A round-trip mission lasting roughly 30 hours with refueling over both the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, involving multiple aircraft dropping a large number of these penetrators on ventilation shafts and other vulnerable points identified through years of intelligence collection on the facility's layout. That mission is now treated as something close to a playbook, both by American planners thinking about how a Pickaxe Mountain strike might be executed, and by Iranian engineers who, according to independent satellite analysis, have spent the time since studying exactly what made Fordow vulnerable and trying to design around it at their new site. There's also a next-generation penetrator reportedly in development, intended to go deeper and operate more effectively in environments where GPS guidance might be jammed or degraded, though details of that program remain limited in open reporting, and it isn't clear whether any such weapon would be ready in time to factor into a near-term decision on Pickaxe Mountain specifically. The domestic political backdrop in the United States adds another layer worth understanding, because it shapes the incentives facing the White House as it decides whether to escalate toward the nuclear track again. Trump campaigned in part on the idea of avoiding new open-ended military commitments in the Middle East. And administration officials spent much of last year insisting that the strikes on Fordow and Natanz had definitively ended the threat, using words like obliteration and monumental to describe the results. 5 months into a renewed, sustained war, with global energy prices moving in response to disruptions at the Strait of Hormuz, and American forces still absorbing casualties in nightly strike operations, the administration now faces real political criticism, including from within its own usual base of support, that it has backed into precisely the kind of prolonged Middle Eastern military entanglement it once promised to avoid. The criticism creates a genuine tension in how any decision about Pickaxe Mountain gets made and explained publicly. On one hand, striking a fortified nuclear facility plays into a narrative of decisive American strength and finishing what last year's operation started. On the other hand, opening a new front against a target that independent experts say may not even be fully destructible with current weapons risks looking like an escalation without a clear resolution, feeding exactly the forever war criticism the administration is trying to get ahead of. How officials navigate that tension in the coming days and weeks is likely to shape both the timing of any strike and how it gets framed publicly if and when it happens. There's also an inspections and verification dimension to this story that tends to get lost in the more dramatic military framing, but that arguably matters more for how this eventually gets resolved diplomatically, if it does at all. The International Atomic Energy Agency has repeatedly emphasized that meaningful international monitoring of Iran's nuclear program, including physical access to sites like Pickaxe Mountain, would do far more to definitively answer the underlying questions about weapons-grade material and intent than satellite imagery or periodic military strikes ever could. Iran's willingness to grant that kind of access has fluctuated throughout the broader standoff over its nuclear program for years, tightening considerably since the strikes began, for reasons Tehran attributes to legitimate sovereignty and security concerns, given that it has already had senior nuclear-linked sites, and, more strikingly, its own head of state killed in direct military action. Western governments and the IAEA have countered that reduced access is precisely what fuels the kind of uncertainty currently driving the American conversation about striking Pickaxe Mountain in the first place, creating something close to a self-reinforcing cycle. Less access breeds more suspicion increases the odds of further strikes, and further strikes make it even less likely Iran agrees to expanded access afterward. Breaking that cycle, if it happens at all, would likely require some form of negotiated inspections arrangement that neither side has shown much appetite for pursuing seriously while active fighting continues elsewhere in the country. Regional reaction to the prospect of a Pickaxe Mountain strike specifically, as distinct from the ongoing conventional strikes around the Strait of Hormuz, has been relatively muted in public so far, which is itself worth noting. Gulf governments that have been vocal about drone and missile intercepts tied to the shipping war have said comparatively little on the record about the nuclear facility question, a silence that regional analysts read partly as a reflection of how much more serious a nuclear site strike would be treated by everyone in the neighborhood, and partly as an unwillingness to publicly weigh in on a decision that remains, as of this recording, still just a stated possibility rather than a fact needing a response. Israel, which played a central role in earlier phases of this broader conflict and has been reported to be repositioning, refueling, and other military assets in the region, has also kept official public commentary on Pickaxe Mountain specifically fairly limited, even as Israeli officials have been cited anonymously in various regional reports offering assessments of the site's construction and of the broader Iranian leadership situation. That relative quiet from the region's other major players is worth watching, because a shift toward louder public positioning in either direction would likely be one of the clearer signals that a decision on Pickaxe Mountain is moving from possibility toward something closer to imminent. Pulling back to the widest possible frame, it's worth remembering that nuclear facility strikes carry a different category of risk and consequence than the conventional military campaign that has otherwise defined this war over the past several weeks. Striking radar sites, missile launchers, and naval infrastructure, however intense and however costly in lives on both sides, is a form of warfare the region has now been living through for months. A strike aimed specifically at nuclear-linked infrastructure introduces the additional risk of radiological or chemical contamination depending on what is actually stored at the site. A heightened diplomatic reaction from countries far outside the immediate region, who watch nuclear proliferation questions closely regardless of their position on the broader war, and a symbolic weight that Iran's government has repeatedly signaled it would treat as crossing into a different category of confrontation altogether. That's part of why independent analysts covering this story keep circling back to the same word: consequential. Whatever happens with Pickaxe Mountain in the coming days or weeks, it's being treated across the board by American officials, by Iranian officials, and by outside experts who don't have a stake in either government's messaging, as a decision point that would meaningfully change the shape and stakes of this war, not just another incremental step in a campaign that has already been running for months. All of this leaves the audience with a genuinely open, unresolved situation rather than a clean story with a predictable ending, and it's worth being honest about that rather than manufacturing false certainty in either direction. A strike on Pickaxe Mountain remains, by the president's own public description, a real possibility that intelligence and military assets appear to be positioning for, but not something that has been confirmed as scheduled or guaranteed, and independent experts remain genuinely divided on whether existing American weapons could even achieve a decisive result against a facility built specifically to defeat them. Iran, for its part, has signaled it would treat such a strike as a major escalation warranting a severe response, even while facing weeks of sustained conventional military pressure elsewhere along its coastline that it has already been absorbing without, so far, backing down from its position on the strait. And underneath all of it sits the same unresolved question that has shadowed this entire phase of the war: how much recoverable nuclear material and capability actually survived last year's strikes? A question that satellite images of tunnel entrances and vehicle activity can only partially answer, and one that may not be conclusively settled until either international inspectors get meaningful access to Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, or the military question gets settled the hard way. Whichever path this takes, it's a story worth continuing to follow closely, because a decision to strike a hardened nuclear facility that Tehran considers among its most sensitive sites would mark one of the most consequential moves of this entire war, with implications that would extend well past Iran's borders, well past the current news cycle, and well past whatever happens in the Strait of Hormuz over these same weeks. It's worth ending on a note of proportion rather than alarm. Wars produce a constant stream of named targets, threatened operations, and worst-case scenarios that don't always materialize on the timeline the loudest voices predict. And Pickaxe Mountain could easily follow that pattern, remaining a watched, threatened site for weeks or months without an actual strike, especially if diplomatic contacts or inspections access shift the calculus in the meantime. It could just as easily become the next major turning point in this war within days. Both outcomes are consistent with everything that's actually been confirmed so far, and the responsible approach for anyone following this story is to keep tracking the concrete, verifiable signals, tanker movements, satellite imagery, inspections access, rather than treating any single dramatic quote as a guarantee of what comes next. There's one more thread worth pulling on before wrapping up, which is how ordinary observers, without security clearances or satellite access, should actually weigh a story like this one. Coverage of Pickaxe Mountain over the past week has ranged from careful, sourced reporting that clearly distinguishes between confirmed satellite evidence and anonymous intelligence claims, to more excitable framing that treats a single radio show comment as equivalent to an operational order already in motion. The honest position sits somewhere in between those two poles. It's true that a sitting American president named a specific hardened nuclear facility by name and said the United States intends to strike it, which is itself unusual and significant regardless of timing. It's also true that the same president, in the same conversation, said intelligence isn't currently seeing activity there that would typically justify urgency, and that independent nuclear security analysts remain divided on whether existing weapons could even achieve a decisive result against a target built specifically to survive them. Holding both of those facts at once, rather than collapsing them into either a strike is definitely coming any night now, or this is just talk that will blow over, is the more accurate and more useful way to understand where things actually stand heading into the next stretch of this war. Watch for any further movement of refueling tankers or long-range bomber assets into the region, since that kind of logistical repositioning has historically been a more reliable early indicator than political rhetoric on its own. Watch independent nuclear monitoring organizations for updated satellite imagery of Pickaxe Mountain's tunnel entrances, since changes in construction activity, camouflage efforts, or vehicle movement are exactly the kind of evidence that shaped the current round of concern in the first place. Watch whether Iran makes any move to grant or further restrict international inspectors' access to its remaining declared nuclear sites, since that would signal something about Tehran's own read of how likely a strike actually is. And watch how the administration talks about this domestically, since the gap between confident, decisive rhetoric aimed at reassuring critics of a forever war and more cautious, intelligence-driven language about not currently seeing activity at the site is itself a signal of how unsettled this decision still is, even from the inside.